Hello, it's me again. I've got just a short slide presentation here to talk to you about some little tidbits about learning, some things that if I had been in a classroom I would have discussed in a more reasonable situation when they fit in with what I was teaching, but looking back I wanted to make sure I covered these. So, classical versus operant. This is an important concept to get. You need to understand the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Sometimes it gets confusing because they both use acquisition, which is getting the behavior, learning, conditioning, extinction, which is when the learned behavior goes away, spontaneous recovery, which remember is after a time period after extinction, you recover the behavior, generalization, reacting the same to similar stimuli, and discrimination, reacting differently to different situations. Classical conditioning uses reflexive behavior. So when you are determining if something is classical conditioning, is the behavior something the animal does not control? Is it a reflex? If you answer yes, it's not something you control. Drooling, for example, with Pavlov's dogs. Your heart racing to a certain song. Things that you do not control. Then that would indicate it would be classical conditioning. So if you think the animal does not have control over the behavior, does not have a choice, that would be classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is voluntary behavior. And the key word here is consequences. We're looking at rewards and punishments. So is it something you can control? Following a curfew, running a maze, things like that. If you can control, does the animal have a choice in how to behave? That would be operant conditioning. Over-justification effect, or how I refer to it as a whole lot of fat kids who don't like to read. Here, what we find is rewards and punishments are good for changing someone's behavior. However, if someone already likes to do something, or even if it's a relatively neutral behavior, if you reward them for doing it, they will make the assumption that there must be something bad, that there must be a reason they're bribing me to do this. And so it lessens the intrinsic, internal, natural motivation. And so now the person is doing it for the reward, which means if you stop rewarding them, they might stop the behavior, most likely will stop the behavior. However, in addition to just that, you've also changed inside, so they might come to resent the behavior. Hence my example, a whole lot of fat kids who don't like to read. I don't know how many of you did Book It back in school. Well-intentioned program. If you remember, you read, and if you read a certain number of things, or if your parents lied and said you read a certain number of things, you got a free pizza from Pizza Hut. Well, pizza can make you fat. And so a whole lot of fat kids who don't like to read, what we did is we told kids, reading must suck because we have to bribe you with pizza to do it. And so therefore, theoretically, we had a whole lot of fat kids who now were only reading to get their pizza. And they used to like to read, or at least were relatively interested in it, and now they've lost that internal motivation. The same thing can be argued for the Six Flags rewards for reading, things like that. Though standing in line with my kids for the Six Flags thing, I often wonder how many people actually had their kids read, or how many parents just signed the form to get a free Six Flags ticket. I guess I'm a little cynical in my age. So again, over-justification effect is when we reward people for doing something they already like to do, and we get rid of that internal like for it. Biological predispositions. We talked a little bit about this in the past. And we talked about Garcia's study that says when we use, or that we make natural associations. When you get sick, you don't think about something you saw, you don't think about other things, you think about what you ate. And that is a strong inborn biologically predisposed reaction to pair getting sick with what you ate. Some other things that happen. One of the reasons we use food is because it's a natural reinforcer for people. We train this wonderful squirrel to ride on his little squirrel water skis, and they trained him using food. We often use food to train animals because it's a natural reinforcer. There are some things that are easier to train people if it's a natural occurrence. Also, instinctive drift. Instinctive drift is that naturally occurring behaviors are always behind this. And so as you are trained to do something, you instinctively drift back to your natural behavior. And I think one of the most glaring examples, which I'm not even sure if you guys remember, but Siegfried and Roy had these wonderful, beautiful, amazing white tigers and this whole big show in Vegas. And they train the animals to be their friends and all this stuff. Well, tiger's natural thing is not to be friends with people and not to do tricks. And so you can listen or look up all the different explanations, but a lot of people theorize that what happened was instinctive drift. And so the tigers were trained to do things, but then they instinctively drifted back to their normal non-friendly behaviors with people or being on stage, and ripped Roy's throat out. Look up more on that story if you wish. That's all I'm going to cover on it. Insight learning, another little tidbit here. There were a bunch of bananas up here. They had to try and figure out how to get there and get the bananas. And sometimes it's not that our learning is conditioned. It's not trial and error. It's like, aha, the aha experience. So insight learning is the aha experience. All of a sudden the light bulb goes off and you get it. You might see this in math problems where all of a sudden you get how to do it. You might get in riddles, things like that. So insight learning is when you have a sudden revelation of what the solution is. And Tolman studied cognitive learning and studied cognitive maps. The theory behind cognitive learning was in contrast a little bit to Thorndike. Thorndike said, you reward behavior, it occurs more. Now, we're not saying that that's wrong. Tolman didn't say that that's wrong, but that it's not that strict. That sometimes we learn things not because of a stimulus response, not because of a current reward. We just learn things. We are thinking and we are actively involved. So cognitive maps, if you think of cognitive as mental or thinking, cognitive maps are mental pictures, a mental representation of one's environment, or something where you create a map of it in your mind, a picture of it in your mind. For example, after you've driven for a long time, you don't have to look down to do different things in the car. You know exactly where things are. You've created a cognitive map. A lot of you have created cognitive maps of what's on your iPod or your cell phone or whatever. You've created that mental representation and you go back to that. And Tolman looked at the fact that we do this all the time. We create mental maps of things. Even though we're not rewarded for them at that time, we create a mental map. And so what he did is he had rats go through mazes. A couple different ways this was done. One of the ways was to walk the rats in cages through the mazes where they were not getting rewarded for it. Put the rat in a cage. If you could see my hands, it'd make more sense. Put the rat in a small cage, carry them through a big example of the maze, and then put them in a smaller example of that maze. And even they would learn when you were carried through and create a mental map, even though they were not rewarded for it. And so the big idea here with Tolman and his mazes, without getting too much into it, is that we create mental pictures. We learn even when we are not rewarded for it. And that concept, latent learning. And latent learning is when we learn without a reward. We do it all the time. Chances are you rode to school You got rides from friends, parents, whatever, for a while before you drove. Then when you drove to school, you very possibly had a mental map in your head. Even though you hadn't been tested on this, you now have learned where things are. You now know how to get there. You also have driven past things. Maybe you had never gone to McDonald's on 21st and Lathrop, but you had driven past there enough so that when you decided you wanted that reward, you tapped into that latent learning and you were able to get that reward, and it was obvious that you had learned where that was. So again, latent learning is learning that occurs even though we're not being rewarded for it at that current time, and we demonstrate it later. All right, I believe that is the